I'm Mia Brooks, 26 years old, and 3 months ago my entire world shattered when my father looked me in the eye and called me worthless. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, but what my own family did next was even worse. If you've ever felt like the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally turned their backs on you when you needed them most, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of deep family pain. It all started 5 years ago when I met Marcus at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. I was hunched over my laptop at a corner table, stress-eating a blueberry muffin while frantically trying to finish a freelance graphic design project that was already 2 days overdue. The espresso machine was hissing loudly, rain was drumming against the large windows, and I was on the verge of a complete breakdown when this tall guy with kind brown eyes approached my table. He wasn't trying to hit on me, he genuinely looked concerned. "Excuse me, but you've been sighing so loudly for the past hour that I'm worried you might hyperventilate," he said with a gentle smile. "I'm Marcus, and I couldn't help but notice you look like you could use either a friend or a very strong drink." Something about his warm voice and the way he didn't immediately assume I wanted to be left alone made me look up from my screen. He was wearing a simple gray sweater that brought out his eyes, and there was something steady about his presence that made me feel instantly calmer. I found myself laughing for the first time in weeks. "I'm Mia, and honestly both would be great." He sat down across from me without invitation, ordered us both hot chocolates, and spent the next 3 hours helping me brainstorm solutions for my impossible deadline. By the time we left that coffee shop, my project was salvageable. My mood had completely shifted, and I had given him my number. What I didn't know then was that Marcus worked private security, specializing in protecting people who had received threats. He was between assignments, which is why he had the luxury of spending an entire afternoon with a stressed-out stranger in a coffee shop. The next 5 years with Marcus were like discovering what real partnership actually felt like. We moved in together after 8 months, finding a cozy apartment above a used bookstore that smelled like old paper and vanilla candles. Marcus would leave for work before sunrise, but he always made sure to leave me little notes on the bathroom mirror written in dry erase marker. "You're going to crush that presentation today," or "Don't forget you're amazing," or sometimes just a terrible pun that would make me groan and smile simultaneously. I started getting bigger design contracts, eventually landing regular work with 3 major Portland businesses. Marcus supported every crazy idea I had, from wanting to paint our bedroom walls deep purple to deciding I needed to learn how to make perfect homemade pasta from scratch. Sunday mornings became sacred. We'd sleep in until 10, then Marcus would make his famous blueberry pancakes while I read him interesting articles from design magazines. He had this habit of humming old jazz standards while he cooked, completely off-key but with such enthusiasm that it became one of my favorite sounds in the world. When I finally worked up the courage to start my own design studio, Marcus spent every weekend for 2 months helping me renovate a small space in the Arts District. He learned how to install track lighting and sand hardwood floors, all so I could have the creative space I'd been dreaming about since college. Our biggest fights were about whose turn it was to do dishes and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. We traveled whenever we could afford it. Weekend trips to the coast, camping in the Cascade Mountains, one magical week in New Orleans where Marcus surprised me by knowing all the best hidden jazz clubs. He never made me feel like his job was more important than mine, even though his work sometimes involved actual life or death situations. I felt safe with him in ways I'd never experienced before, not just physically but emotionally. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be with someone who saw my potential instead of my flaws. By our 4th year together, life felt almost too good to be true. My design studio was thriving with a waiting list of clients and a small team of freelancers who had become like family. Marcus had been promoted to lead a security team for high-profile clients, which meant better pay and more control over his schedule. We had developed this comfortable rhythm where I'd work late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he'd pick up dinner from our favorite Thai place and surprise me at the studio with pad see ew and mango sticky rice. We spent Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where Marcus knew all the vendors by name and I had standing orders with the flower lady and the woman who made incredible sourdough bread. He proposed on a random Tuesday in April while we were assembling IKEA furniture in our living room. I was cursing at the impossible instruction manual for a new bookshelf, and he just looked at me struggling with an Allen wrench and said, "I want to build furniture with you for the rest of our lives." He didn't even have a ring yet. We picked it out together the following weekend, a simple vintage piece from an estate sale that felt more meaningful than anything from a traditional jewelry store. We started planning a small wedding for the following spring, dreaming about the farmhouse we wanted to buy outside the city, talking about the kids we might have someday and what we'd name them. Marcus had started working with a client who owned several successful restaurants, providing security during high-profile events and protecting the owner's family during a particularly ugly business dispute. The money was excellent, but more importantly, Marcus felt like he was making a real difference. I remember thinking that we had somehow managed to build exactly the kind of life I'd always wanted, but never believed was actually possible. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. We weren't perfect, but we loved each other's imperfections. Every morning when I woke up next to Marcus, I felt grateful in a way that seemed almost too simple to be real. But there were small warning signs that I chose to ignore, tiny cracks in what I thought was our solid foundation. Marcus had been getting more phone calls during our personal time, stepping out onto the balcony to take them with a serious expression I couldn't quite read. He started mentioning his client's family situation more often, talking about how the threats against them had escalated beyond typical business disputes. One evening in late October, I found him sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, looking more stressed than I'd seen him in months. When I asked about it, he said his client had requested additional protection for some family members who lived out of state, which might mean more travel for him. I remember feeling a tiny twist of anxiety in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Marcus had always been completely transparent about his work, so I trusted that he'd tell me if there was anything I needed to worry about. The phone calls became more frequent, and sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with an expression I couldn't identify. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd always smile and say everything was fine, then distract me with kisses or suggestions for weekend plans. Looking back now, I realize he was trying to protect me from something he hoped would resolve itself quickly. That Tuesday in January started like any other day, but by noon everything had changed forever. I was at the studio working on a logo design for a new brewery when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional but urgent, explaining that Marcus had been shot during what should have been a routine security check at his client's warehouse. The words didn't make sense at first: shot, surgery, stable but critical condition, hospital, come immediately. I remember dropping my coffee mug and watching it shatter across the concrete floor of my studio, the sound echoing in the sudden silence that seemed to swallow everything else. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my keys, and I drove to the hospital in a haze of disbelief and terror, running 3 red lights and parking illegally in the emergency zone because I literally could not process normal rules anymore. The next 72 hours were a blur of antiseptic smells, uncomfortable waiting room chairs, and watching Marcus drift in and out of consciousness while machines beeped steadily around his hospital bed. The bullet had missed major organs, but had done significant damage to his shoulder and chest, requiring multiple surgeries and a recovery time measured in months, not weeks. His client had arranged for the best possible medical care and had posted security outside Marcus's hospital room, but the reality of what had happened was slowly sinking in. Someone had specifically targeted Marcus, not as collateral damage but as a deliberate message to his client. The police were investigating, but the detective explained that cases like this often took months to resolve, and in the meantime, everyone involved needed to be extremely careful. I had gone from planning our wedding to wondering if the person I loved most in the world was going to survive, and I needed my family's support more than I'd ever needed anything in my life. My family has always been complicated, but I thought that in a real crisis, they would show up for me the way Marcus always had. My parents, Robert and Catherine, lived about an hour outside Portland in the suburb where I grew up. My younger brother David still lived at home while attending community college, and my older sister Michelle worked in marketing for a tech company in Seattle. We weren't the closest family, but we talked regularly and saw each other for all major holidays. My parents had always been somewhat critical of my choices. They thought graphic design was an impractical career, they worried that Marcus's job was too dangerous. They questioned why we weren't already married after 4 years together. But I assumed that when something terrible actually happened, all those petty concerns would disappear and they'd focus on what really mattered. I was wrong in ways that still take my breath away. I called my mother from the hospital waiting room on Wednesday evening, crying so hard I could barely speak clearly. I explained what had happened to Marcus, that he was in surgery, that I was terrified and alone and needed them. Her first question wasn't, "Is he going to be okay?" or "What can we do to help?" It was, "Are you sure you should be involved in this? This sounds like dangerous people, Mia. Maybe this is a sign that you should reconsider this relationship." I was so shocked by her response that I actually stopped crying for a moment. I tried to explain that Marcus hadn't done anything wrong, that he was the victim of a crime, that he needed weeks of recovery and I was going to need help taking care of him. My mother's voice got that familiar distant tone she used when she disagreed with my decisions but didn't want to start an argument. "We'll visit when things calm down," she said, "but Mia, you need to think about whether this is the kind of life you want. These people have guns and they're targeting your boyfriend. What if next time they target you?" The conversation ended with her promising to talk to your father and get back to me, but something in her tone made it clear that I shouldn't expect much support. I hung up feeling more alone than I had even sitting by myself in that sterile waiting room. Over the next few days, I left multiple voicemails and sent texts with updates about Marcus's condition and requests for visits or help. My sister Michelle called back once to say she was thinking of us but couldn't take time off work to visit. David sent a few emoji responses to my texts but never actually called. My father didn't respond at all until I sent a message saying that Marcus was being discharged and would need someone to drive him to follow-up appointments while his arm was still in a sling. His response was a single sentence, "Sorry, Mia, but we can't get involved in whatever this situation really is." That text message was the moment I realized that my family saw Marcus's shooting not as a random tragedy that had happened to someone they cared about, but as evidence that my life choices were fundamentally wrong and potentially dangerous to them. 3 days after Marcus came home from the hospital, my mother finally called. She had clearly rehearsed what she was going to say, speaking in that careful voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable while delivering completely unreasonable news. "Mia, your father and I have been talking and we think you need to seriously consider whether this relationship is worth the risk. This Marcus person has clearly gotten himself involved with some very dangerous people, and now you're involved too. We can't support a situation that might put our whole family in danger. We think you should come home for a while, let him figure out his own problems, and give yourself some space to think clearly about what you really want from life." I was so stunned by what she was saying that I couldn't immediately respond. When I finally found my voice, I tried to explain that Marcus was recovering from being shot while doing his job, that he hadn't done anything wrong, that this wasn't about lifestyle choices but about supporting someone I loved through a medical crisis. But my mother had clearly made up her mind. "Mia, you're 26 years old and you're throwing your life away for some security guard who attracts violence. We raised you better than this. If you continue down this path, you're going to have to do it without our support." The call ended with her hanging up on me, and I sat on my couch next to Marcus, who was pretending to be asleep but had obviously heard every word and realized that I was completely on my own. 2 weeks later, my family's true priorities became crystal clear when they planned a surprise birthday party for my cousin Rachel without inviting me. I found out about it through social media posts the day after it happened. Pictures of my parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins all celebrating together at my uncle's house. The same uncle's house where I had spent countless childhood holidays, where I had always been included in every family gathering for 26 years. The post showed elaborate decorations, a professionally made cake, and everyone wearing matching t-shirts that Rachel had made for the occasion. My sister Michelle had driven down from Seattle for the party. My brother David had taken time off work. My parents had clearly spent considerable time and money organizing the whole event. But I hadn't even been told it was happening. When I called my mother to ask why I hadn't been invited, she said, "We decided it was better to keep things simple right now, Mia. Given everything that's going on with your situation, we thought it would be easier for everyone if you sat this one out." Her tone suggested that my situation, meaning my boyfriend recovering from being shot, was somehow contagious or embarrassing. Rachel had been one of my closest family relationships growing up. We were only 6 months apart in age and had always celebrated our birthdays together. But apparently, being associated with me had become a liability that my family wasn't willing to take on. The final betrayal came when Marcus was scheduled for his third surgery to repair nerve damage in his shoulder. I had asked my family multiple times for help during his recovery, someone to sit with him during the 8-hour procedure, help with grocery shopping since I couldn't leave him alone for long periods, assistance with the mountain of insurance paperwork that seemed to require constant attention. Each request was met with excuses or silence, but the morning of Marcus's surgery, my father called with a request of his own. He wanted me to co-sign a loan so my brother David could buy a car for his new job. It's only $20,000, Mia, and David really needs reliable transportation. You know we'd do the same for you if the situation were different, he said, as if I hadn't been begging them for help for weeks and getting nothing but criticism in return. When I pointed out that I was spending that day waiting through Marcus's surgery and maybe this wasn't the best time to discuss financial favors, my father's voice got cold. This is exactly what we're talking about, Mia. You've become completely self-centered since you got involved with this guy. David needs our help as a family, but all you can talk about is this drama with some security guard who got himself shot. We need an answer about the loan by the end of the week. I hung up on him, finally understanding that my family saw Marcus's trauma as an inconvenience that was preventing me from fulfilling my real obligations to them. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Sunday in March when my parents invited me to dinner at their house under the pretense of working things out as a family. I should have known it was a trap when my mother specifically requested that I come alone, saying that Marcus was still recovering and probably wasn't up for a big family discussion. But I was desperate to repair the relationship with my family, and some part of me still believed that if I could just explain the situation clearly enough, they would realize how badly they had hurt me and want to make things right. Marcus tried to convince me not to go, pointing out that they had shown me exactly who they were over the past few months and I should believe them. But I was still holding on to the hope that the parents who had raised me were somewhere underneath all this selfishness and would eventually show up for me the way parents were supposed to. I drove to my childhood home that Sunday afternoon with a mixture of hope and dread churning in my stomach. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The carefully maintained lawn, the seasonal wreath on the front door, the subtle signs of middle-class prosperity that my parents had worked hard to achieve and maintain. But walking up the front steps felt different somehow, like I was approaching a place where I was no longer entirely welcome. My mother answered the door with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the first thing she said was, "I'm so glad you decided to come, sweetheart. We've really missed having you around." The tone was wrong though, too cheerful, too deliberate, like she was performing the role of loving mother rather than actually being one. Dinner was awkward from the beginning, with everyone trying too hard to act normal while avoiding any mention of Marcus or the past few months. My father asked about my business, but in a way that suggested he was going through the motions rather than actually caring about my answer. David kept looking at his phone and making comments about how good the pot roast was, clearly trying to fill the uncomfortable silences. Michelle, who had driven down from Seattle specifically for this dinner, kept steering the conversation towards safe topics like the weather and local news. But I could feel the tension building throughout the meal, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The moment finally came when my mother served dessert, and my father cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to say something he considered important. "Mia, we asked you here tonight because we need to have a serious conversation about your future," he began, using the same tone he had used when I was 16 and had gotten caught sneaking out to a party. "Over the past few months, we've watched you make choices that frankly have us very concerned. This situation with Marcus has shown us that you're not thinking clearly about what's best for your life, and as your family, we feel obligated to intervene before things get worse." I felt my stomach drop as I realized this wasn't going to be the reconciliation I had hoped for. "We've been talking to some people, and we found a great opportunity for you in Denver. Michelle's company has an opening in their design department, and they're willing to interview you based on her recommendation. It would be a fresh start, away from all this drama and violence, with a steady paycheck and health benefits. We think you should seriously consider taking it." I stared at him in disbelief, trying to process what he was actually suggesting. Dad, I have a business here. I have clients who depend on me. I have a life here. And Marcus is still recovering from being shot. I can't just abandon everything and move to Denver. My mother jumped in with that reasonable tone she used when she was about to say something completely unreasonable. Sweetheart, that's exactly the problem. You're so wrapped up in this situation that you can't see clearly anymore. Marcus is a grown man, and his problems aren't your responsibility. You're 26 years old and you're wasting the best years of your life playing nurse to someone who chose a dangerous career. This job in Denver is a real opportunity for a stable future. The conversation escalated quickly from there, with my family taking turns explaining all the ways that my relationship with Marcus was problematic and how I needed to prioritize my real future over what they kept calling this situation. My father pointed out that Marcus would probably never be able to do security work again with his shoulder injury, implying that I would end up financially supporting him. Michelle added that my business was just freelancing anyway, and not a real career compared to a corporate job with benefits. David, who had barely spoken all evening, suddenly chimed in to say that all his friends thought it was weird that I was dating someone whose job involved getting shot at by criminals. Each comment felt like a knife twisting deeper, and I realized that they had planned this entire intervention to convince me to abandon the person I loved when he needed me most. The breaking point came when I tried to explain that Marcus had been the most supportive, loving partner I'd ever had, and that what happened to him was a random act of violence that could have happened to anyone. My father's expression hardened, and he leaned forward across the dining room table with a look I had never seen before. Mia, listen to yourself. You're defending a man who attracts violence and danger into your life. You're prioritizing someone else's problems over your own family's concerns. You've become selfish and stubborn, and frankly, you're acting worthless as a daughter and a sister. We raised you to have better judgment than this, but you're choosing to throw away everything we taught you for some guy who's going to drag you down with him. The word worthless hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This was my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework and walked me down the aisle at my high school graduation. And he was calling me worthless because I wouldn't abandon the person I loved during his recovery from a traumatic injury. I looked around the table at my family, my mother nodding in agreement, Michelle looking uncomfortable but not disagreeing, David avoiding eye contact entirely, and realized that none of them were going to defend me or tell my father that he had gone too far. I was about to respond when I heard the front door open and Marcus's voice calling my name. I had texted him the address when I arrived, and he must have gotten worried when dinner lasted longer than expected. My family's faces immediately shifted from disappointed to alarmed as heavy footsteps approached the dining room. Marcus appeared in the doorway, and I had never been more grateful to see anyone in my entire life. He was still wearing the sling that supported his healing shoulder, but everything about his presence radiated protective strength. He took in the scene quickly, my tear-stained face, my family's guilty expressions, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Mia, is everything okay?" he asked, but his eyes never left my father's face. There was something different about Marcus in that moment, something harder and more dangerous than I'd ever seen from him. This wasn't my gentle boyfriend who hummed while making pancakes, this was the professional who had spent years protecting people from threats. My father, who had been so confident and aggressive just moments before, suddenly looked small and uncertain. "Actually, we were just having a family discussion," my mother said with forced politeness. "This doesn't really concern you, Marcus." The dismissal in her tone was obvious, but Marcus didn't move from the doorway. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "Mia, do you want to be here right now?" The question was simple, but it cut through all the guilt and obligation and family pressure that had been suffocating me for months. For the first time in this entire nightmare, someone was asking what I wanted instead of telling me what I should do. "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I really don't." Marcus nodded and stepped aside so I could get up from the table. As I stood to leave, my father made one last attempt to control the situation. "Mia, if you walk out that door with him, don't bother coming back until you're ready to act like part of this family again." But Marcus was already handing me my coat, and something about his calm, protective presence made my father's threats seem as powerless as they actually were. "Actually, Mr. Brooks," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. After what I just heard, I think Mia is better off without this kind of family. She deserves people who support her when she's going through the hardest time of her life, not people who call her worthless for showing loyalty and love. The silence that followed was deafening, and I realized that no one in my family had ever stood up to my father like that before. We walked out together and I didn't look back. The drive home was silent except for the sound of my crying, not the desperate, hopeless tears I had been shedding for months, but tears of relief and grief and angry recognition. Marcus didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances or advice. He just drove carefully with one hand and held my hand with the other, letting me process everything at my own pace. When we got back to our apartment, he made me tea and sat with me on the couch while I finally told him everything my family had said and done over the past few months. He listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief, his jaw getting tighter as I described each betrayal. Mia, he said when I finished, I am so sorry that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally showed you how conditional their love really was. But I need you to know that none of what they said about you is true. You are not worthless, you are not selfish, you are not making bad choices. You are one of the strongest, most loyal people I have ever known, and what you've done for me these past few months has literally saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with medical care. His words broke something open in my chest that had been locked tight for months, and I cried until I had no tears left. Over the following weeks, I had to rebuild my entire understanding of what family meant and what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. My parents made a few attempts to contact me, but only to repeat their demands that I choose between them and Marcus. Michelle sent a card saying she hoped I would come to my senses soon. David texted occasionally with surface-level messages that avoided any mention of what had happened. None of them apologized for calling me worthless or for abandoning me during the worst crisis of my life. None of them asked how Marcus was recovering or acknowledged that their response to his injury had been cruel and selfish. The silence from my family was painful, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant pressure to manage their disapproval and criticism, I had more energy to focus on the things that actually mattered. Marcus's recovery progressed steadily, and we developed new routines that accommodated his physical limitations while allowing both of us to feel useful and productive. My business continued to thrive, actually growing because I wasn't constantly distracted by family drama and guilt. Our friends rallied around us in ways that showed me what real support looked like. Bringing meals during Marcus's surgery recovery, helping with errands when I couldn't leave him alone for long periods, offering both practical help and emotional encouragement without making it feel like a burden or obligation. 8 months after that terrible dinner, my uncle called to tell me that my grandmother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. He said the family was planning to take turns helping with her care, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to participate. The request came with obvious strings attached. My participation in my grandmother's care was contingent on me working things out with my parents first, which really meant apologizing for choosing Marcus over their demands and agreeing to prioritize family obligations over my own relationship. But something fundamental had shifted in me during those months of estrangement. I loved my grandmother deeply, and I wanted to help with her care, but not at the cost of pretending that my family's behavior had been acceptable or allowing them to use my grandmother's illness as leverage to control my life. I told my uncle that I would be happy to contribute to my grandmother's care directly, financially and through visits, but that I wouldn't participate in any family meetings or group decisions until my parents acknowledged how badly they had treated me and Marcus. The family's response was swift and predictable. I was accused of being selfish and holding grudges, of using my grandmother's illness to punish them for trying to help me make better choices. But this time their guilt trips and manipulations didn't work because I had learned the difference between people who loved me and people who only loved their version of me. Marcus had shown me what unconditional support looked like, and our friends had demonstrated that healthy relationships didn't require me to choose between loyalty and self-respect. 2 years later, my parents finally reached out with what seemed like a genuine attempt at reconciliation. They had apparently spent time in family therapy after my grandmother's condition worsened, and they claimed to understand that their response to Marcus's shooting had been inappropriate and hurtful. They wanted to meet for dinner to apologize and start rebuilding our relationship. I was skeptical but hopeful, and Marcus encouraged me to give them a chance while maintaining clear boundaries about what kind of treatment I would and wouldn't accept. The reconciliation dinner was awkward but promising. My parents actually apologized for calling me worthless and acknowledged that their fear about Marcus's dangerous job had caused them to respond selfishly during his recovery. They admitted that they had been wrong to try to force me to choose between my family and my relationship, and they expressed genuine regret for missing important months of my life. The apology felt real, and for the first time in years, I felt hopeful that we might be able to rebuild a healthier relationship. However, the reconciliation came with conditions that showed me how much work we still had to do. My parents were willing to accept Marcus and include him in family gatherings, but they made it clear that they didn't want to hear about the unpleasant details of his work or any future security concerns. They wanted a relationship with me that existed in a carefully controlled bubble where difficult topics were avoided and their comfort was prioritized over authentic communication. It was better than the complete estrangement we had experienced, but it wasn't the deep, supportive relationship I had always wanted with my family. Today, 3 years after that terrible dinner, my relationship with my family exists in a carefully maintained middle ground. We see each other for major holidays and family milestones, and the conversations are pleasant but surface level. They have learned not to criticize my life choices directly, and I have learned not to expect the kind of emotional support from them that Marcus and our chosen family provide so naturally. It's not the relationship I grew up dreaming of having with my parents, but it's sustainable and respectful, which is more than I thought possible for a long time. Marcus and I got married last spring in a small ceremony surrounded by the people who had supported us through the darkest period of our lives. My family attended and behaved appropriately, but the people who truly celebrated with us were the friends who had shown up with groceries during Marcus's recovery, who had listened to me cry without offering unwanted advice, who had never made me feel like loving someone through a crisis was anything other than exactly what love should look like. If you're watching this and you recognize your own family in this story, I want you to know that you are not responsible for managing other people's emotional reactions to your life choices. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, even if those people raised you and claim to love you. Real love supports you during the hardest moments of your life. It doesn't abandon you when loving you becomes inconvenient or complicated. I learned that some people will only love the version of you that makes their lives easier, and when you refuse to be that person, they will try to convince you that you're being selfish or disloyal. But choosing to protect yourself and the people you love isn't selfish, it's necessary. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's worst behavior, even when that someone is family. The warning signs I wish I had recognized earlier include people who disappear during your crisis but expect your help during theirs, people who make your trauma about their comfort, people who use guilt and obligation to control your choices, and people who call you selfish for having boundaries. If someone's love for you depends on you making choices they approve of, that's not unconditional love, that's control disguised as care. For anyone dealing with family members who are trying to force you to choose between them and the person you love, remember that healthy people don't issue ultimatums about relationships. They might express concerns or ask questions, but they don't demand that you abandon someone you care about to prove your loyalty to them. When someone forces you to choose, they're usually showing you exactly how little they actually value you. The practical steps that helped me through this situation include documenting the hurtful things people said so I couldn't gaslight myself later, building a support network of friends who became my chosen family, setting clear boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't tolerate, and working with a therapist who helped me recognize that my family's dysfunction wasn't my responsibility to fix. Most importantly, I learned that you can grieve the family you thought you had while building the family you actually deserve. Some of us have to create our own families from friends, partners, mentors, and communities that choose to love us without conditions. There's nothing wrong with you if your biological family can't or won't provide the support you need. That's their limitation, not your failure. To everyone who has stayed with me through this entire story, thank you for creating a community where we can share these painful experiences and remind each other that we're not alone. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments, not the details if they're too painful, but just a simple "me too" so others know they're not the only ones who have faced these impossible choices. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about choosing yourself when the people who are supposed to love you make it clear that their comfort matters more than your well-being. Next week, I'll be sharing the story of how Marcus and I rebuilt our lives after his career-ending injury and discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also lead to the best thing that happens to you. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how well you manage other people's emotions or how many of their unreasonable demands you're willing to meet. You deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, especially during the moments when loving you requires some courage and sacrifice. Don't settle for less than that, no matter who is offering you their conditional version of love instead. You are worth so much more than that, and I hope you never let anyone convince you otherwise.